Chapter 6. Stakeout. So are you grounded? Like forever? That was Stephen's first question when we met at the bus stop Monday morning. He could have tried to telephone on Saturday or Sunday. He didn't call me very often these days, and it was usually just to ask about homework. No, I said, I'm not grounded, not anymore. My mom and dad are going to talk to the principal this morning, so stay tuned. I don't get it, Stephen said. How you got such rotten grades. You never do worse than me. I ignored his bad grammar and shrugged. Well, I did this time. I could tell he had more questions, but Lee and Ben came whooping down the street, and Ben shouted, Hey, Stephen, guess what? I got $40 for my grades, so I got the new Sims game. And it was like I had disappeared. That's another thing about fifth grade. Stephen didn't even try to include me when his guy friends were around. But I didn't make it into a big deal. Besides, I had plenty to think about on the bus ride to school. My first period class was language arts, and every other Monday Mrs. Noyes took us to the library. Our media center was right across the hall from the main office, so I grabbed a copy of Time magazine and got a chair with a clear view of the entrance hall. I pretended to read, but I was on stakeout duty. At 9:07, my mom and dad showed up. I saw Mrs. Hackney come out of her office and shake hands with each of them. Then they followed her back inside, and her door shut behind them. At 9:14, the intercom in the library chimed, and the school secretary voice said, Mrs. Noyes, please come to the main office. Mrs. Noyes walked across the hall, and the secretary steered her into the principal's office. At 9:16, Mrs. Noyes hurried out of the office and down the hall toward her classroom. Less than a minute later, she was back, still hurrying, and she had something in her hand. It was her green grade book. I had a pretty good idea what was going on in the principal's office. At 9:23, my parents left. I ducked behind my magazine in case they looked my way. Then it was all clear. When Mrs. Noyes came back into the library, I kept my eyes on the page in front of me. But I have good peripheral vision. Mrs. Noyes looked right at me, a long, slow look. And then she went into the librarian's office. She shut the door and started talking to Mrs. Byrne. When I glanced up a minute later, they were both looking at me. By fourth period math, Mrs. Noyes must have already talked to Mrs. Zhang, because after we went over the homework, Mrs. Zhang looked right at me and said, Nora, are you sure you understand this? And when she assigned our new work, Mrs. Zhang came over and asked me to do 2 problems while she watched. She had never done that before. And it was like that all day. All my teachers paid more attention to me, sort of checking up on me all the time. And I understood exactly why. Most kids think that if they get bad grades, it's their problem. But that's not true. The fact is, when a kid gets a bad grade, it's like the teacher is getting a bad grade too, and the principal, and the whole school, and the whole town, and the whole state. And don't forget the parents. A bad grade for a kid is a bad grade for everybody. After school, I hurried to the media center because I wanted to get there before all the computers got reserved. I'd been staying after school for the extended day program since first grade. I could either go to the gym or the library. I almost always went to the library. Stephen did the extended day program too because both his parents worked, same as mine. But he only went to the library once in a while. No one was using my favorite computer over in the corner, so I sat and punched in my password. When the system recognized me, I opened up the internet browser, went to Google, and typed in Connecticut Mastery Testing. There were a ton of web pages, and I found my favorite one. It listed 9 ways the state should improve the CMT. I'd been online for about 3 minutes when Mrs. Byrne came walking toward me, so I switched screens to a kids page about ocean currents. I didn't want her to know the kind of research I was doing. Mrs. Byrne smiled and said, "Nora, I just got a call from Mrs. Hackney. She'd like to talk to you in her office." "Now?" I asked. "Today?" She nodded. "That's what she said. I'll walk over with you, okay?" I said, "Sure. Can I leave my things here, or should I bring them?" "Better bring them," she said, "just to be sure they're safe." I grabbed my book bag and my jacket. My mind was zooming along at 1,000,000 miles an hour. This little talk with Mrs. Hackney wasn't in my plan. "But so what?" I said to myself. "You knew something like this could happen sooner or later, right?" So what if it's a whole lot sooner? No big deal. By the time we walked to the principal's office, I had calmed myself down. No big deal, I told myself again. Then the door opened. Wrong. It was a big deal. A very big deal. My mom and dad were sitting at the large round conference table. And Mrs. Noyes, and Mrs. Zhang, and Mrs. Card, the music teacher, and Miss Perill, the art teacher, and Mr. McKay, the gym teacher, and Dr. Trindler, the guidance counselor. Mrs. Byrne followed me in and took a seat next to Mrs. Noyes. And there they sat, all my teachers, and my parents, and the guidance counselor, and the principal. Mrs. Hackney stood up and smiled and nodded at me. I must have had an awful look on my face because she said, "Please don't be scared, Nora. This is a very friendly little group. When your parents stopped in this morning, I decided it would be a good idea for all of us to get together and talk about your report card. Sorry to surprise you, but we didn't want you to worry about it all day. Because, honestly, there is absolutely nothing to worry about. Please take a seat there between your mom and dad. And remember, we are all here because we care about you." Everyone was smiling and nodding at me as I sat down. I learned an important fact at that moment. Just because I'm really smart doesn't mean that I can't have a good old-fashioned panic attack.